The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council was one of the largest enclosed spaces ever constructed by any species in the known galaxy. It sat at the heart of Nexus Station, a colossal ring of metal and engineered light that orbited the golden star known as Vorin Prime. 412 delegations occupied the curved tiers that rose from the central floor all the way up to a ceiling so distant that the upper levels were lost in a kind of permanent, carefully maintained twilight. The architecture had been designed, centuries ago, to make everyone inside feel appropriately small. It had always succeeded at that. On this particular morning, every seat was filled and every translation earpiece was active. Ambassador Selene Voss sat at the human delegation's table near the back of the lowest tier. It was not a prestigious location. The species with the most power sat closest to the floor, where the acoustic baffles worked best and the vote display panels were easiest to read without straining. Humanity had occupied the same back-tier position for most of its 2 centuries of membership. Early ambassadors had submitted formal requests to be relocated. The requests had been assigned case numbers and placed in administrative queues from which nothing had ever emerged. Selene was 53 years old. Her hair was silver and cut short and practical. Her eyes were dark and steady and had seen 11 years of sessions in this hall. She had learned its rhythms the way a person learns the rhythms of a place they have spent too long inside. She knew which delegates spoke the longest while saying the least. She knew which species found direct eye contact a form of aggression and which found the absence of it an insult. She had learned to read the room before the session even officially opened. She had also, in the past month, timed the walk from her table to the exit twice, just to be certain. Motion 7441 was listed on the day's agenda as reduction of human voting rights within the Council Assembly for purposes of structural rationalization and consensus efficiency. The supporting documentation was 40 pages long. Its language was careful and procedural and entirely free of any word that sounded like what it actually meant. What it meant was that humanity's single voting seat was to be converted to an observer designation. Observers could attend. They could submit written comments for the record. They could not vote, could not introduce motions, could not force anything to a floor debate. They could watch and write and be seen to have been consulted without being consulted at all. Ambassador Velkarath of the Cathari Dominion rose to introduce the motion. He was tall and gray-skinned, with 4 arms folded across his chest in the posture of formal authority his species used when they wanted to project both competence and calm. He spoke well. He always spoke well. The Cathari had been in the council for nearly 3,000 years, and they had the long-practiced ability to make whatever served their interests sound like it served everyone's interests. His speech was about efficiency and clarity, and the need for a modern council to reflect modern realities. He used the word rationalization 6 times. He did not say the word human once. He did not look at Selene Voss at any point during the speech. Selene listened. She was good at listening. She had spent 11 years listening in this room and had become skilled at tracking what was said and what was not said and which of the two was more important on any given day. She did not take notes. Her notepad was open in front of her from habit, but she had stopped writing in it some time ago. She was thinking about her first year as ambassador, when she had believed with complete conviction that the right argument, presented correctly, at the right moment, would shift things. That year she had filed 14 formal objections to various council motions. She had built coalition contacts with 6 other smaller species who shared human concerns about representation equity. She had submitted economic analyses showing the value of human contributions to council infrastructure. The analyses were good. The arguments were sound. The motions passed anyway, because sound arguments do not change vote counts when vote counts are determined by something other than arguments. She had kept filing. For 11 years she had kept filing because the record mattered even when no one was reading it. She believed that. She still believed it, actually, as she sat at the table and watched Velkarath finish his introduction. She just no longer believed it was sufficient. When Velkorath sat down, the floor was opened for additional statements of support. A dozen hands from a dozen species rose immediately. Selene pressed the small button on her table that activated the human delegation's response indicator. The council chair, a creature called the Eldest of Thule who was so old that it communicated through a voice synthesis collar, designed specifically for the sounds its original vocal apparatus could no longer make, looked at the indicator light and then at Selene, and after a pause, recognized her. Selene stood. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the room. She had spent 11 years looking at this room from this table, and this was the last time she was going to do it, so she took a moment and looked carefully. 412 species returned her attention in their various ways, some with curiosity, some with professional neutrality, a few with something that might have been genuine interest in what she was about to say. On the table in front of her was the portfolio she had carried into every session for 3 years. It was thick and heavy, and contained 11 years of carefully documented official requests, formal complaints, denied appeals, unanswered letters, and case files that had been assigned numbers, and then stored in administrative databases where they aged undisturbed. The accumulated paper weight of a civilization that had tried, correctly and persistently, to be heard. She picked it up. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then she set it down gently and pushed it to one side. "We are done trying to belong here," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The translation system carried it simultaneously to every earpiece in the room, rendering it in 412 languages in the fraction of a second between Selene's mouth and the nearest pickup. The hall went quiet, not the quiet of respectful attention, the quiet of collective confusion at something that did not fit the expected shape of events. Ambassador Velkorath was the first to recover. He made a sound his collar rendered as polite skepticism. Several delegates shifted in their seats in ways that expressed the same sentiment across different biologies. From the upper tiers came a sound that was unmistakably brief amusement, quickly suppressed. Selene reached into her jacket pocket and placed a small silver disc on the table, no larger than her palm. It was a broadcast initiator linked by encrypted signal to every human ship, station, colony, and diplomatic post in council space. She had carried it for 6 weeks. She pressed it without ceremony. "As of this moment," she said, "the human diplomatic corps is recalling all personnel from council jurisdiction. Every human engineer, every human medic, every human technician, and every human contractor currently operating under council agreements has received recall orders. They will be returning home within 72 hours. All bilateral cooperation agreements are suspended, pending a review we do not intend to complete. This delegation is withdrawing immediately." She picked up her jacket. She looked at the room one last time. She did not feel anger. She did not feel grief. She felt the particular lightness that comes when something you have been carrying for a very long time is finally set down. "Good luck," she said, and she walked out. The silence lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Then the hall filled with sound as 412 species began talking simultaneously, and the translation system strained under the load. Velkorath was on his feet. He said this was a performance. He said humanity was too dependent on council infrastructure to follow through. He said Selene Voss would be back at the table within the month, because where else could she possibly go? Other delegates agreed with him. The agreement was comfortable and certain, and built entirely on assumptions that had never been seriously tested, because there had never before been a reason to test them. The debate ran for 4 hours and 17 minutes. It was thorough and confident and resolved exactly as it was always going to resolve. Motion 7440 won passed by a vote of 389 to 11. The result was recorded and announced. The session was closed. The human delegation's response light was still lit because no one had gone to turn it off. No human was present to receive the result. In the docking bay corridor, Selene walked at a steady pace. Her communicator was already filling with acknowledgments from across human space, one cluster after another arriving in the same word: ready. They had all been waiting for this signal, some for years. Each one was ready. Each one had been ready quietly without drawing attention to it for a long time. She boarded the transport without looking back. The docking clamps released. The ship moved. Through the porthole, the immense silver curve of Nexus Station caught the light of Vorin Prime and shone with the absolute, indifferent beauty of a thing that does not know it is being left. She turned away from the window and opened her work screen. The next part of this story was not going to write itself, and there was a great deal of it to write. Behind her in the Grand Assembly Hall, the speeches were still going. The lights were still on. No one had noticed yet that the last human ship had undocked and slipped into the dark. The first sign came from a maintenance log, which was perhaps fitting. Maintenance logs were not the kind of document that received attention until something stopped working. After that, they received a great deal of attention, but by then it was too late for the attention to be useful. Relay Tower 9 was one of 47 communication towers positioned at intervals throughout Council space to relay faster-than-light signals from one star system to the next. Each tower was large, the size of a small station, and each required constant maintenance. The systems that carried signals across interstellar distances were precise and temperamental. They drifted. Calibration cycles that were missed by days could produce small errors that accumulated over weeks into large ones. The towers were essential infrastructure, the nervous system of the Council, and they needed people who understood them to keep them working. For 19 years, that had been a team of human engineers. The team had left 11 days after the withdrawal. They had not left in disorder or anger. They had completed the last calibration cycle covered by their contracts, filed their final maintenance log, and departed on schedule with the recall orders the rest of human space had received. The maintenance system had logged their departure. It had also logged the next scheduled calibration cycle. No one had been assigned to perform it, because the question of who would perform it had been on a review committee's agenda for 14 months, and the committee had not yet met. The alert that the cycle had not been completed was automatically transmitted to the Council's Department of Infrastructure, where it was assigned a priority level and placed in a work order queue. By the end of the first week after the withdrawal, 41 of the 47 towers had filed similar alerts. The queue had exceeded the processing capacity of the Department of Infrastructure, which distributed the backlog across 3 departments, each of which assumed one of the others was handling the urgent items. None of them were. The communication network did not fail suddenly. It degraded in the way that complex systems degrade when the people who maintain them are gone, gradually, unevenly, and in ways that were easy to attribute to other causes, until the cumulative drift became impossible to ignore. Messages that should have arrived in seconds took minutes. Messages that should have taken minutes took hours. Some messages stopped arriving at all, bouncing between towers whose alignment had drifted by fractions that were invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, but catastrophic in their accumulated effect. By the end of the second month, the network was running at below 60% capacity. It kept falling. The Council's Department of Infrastructure held an assessment meeting. They agreed that the situation was serious. They formed a subcommittee. The subcommittee's first meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later, after the appropriate notice period for all relevant parties had been observed. 6 weeks after the withdrawal, on the Cathari colony world of Velkara, a hemorrhagic fever broke out in the southern coastal settlements. It was not an unfamiliar disease. The Council's medical database had a full treatment protocol for it. The protocol was effective. The problem was not the knowledge, but the distance between the knowledge and the people who needed it. The Human Rapid Response Medical Station had been stationed 4 hours from Velkara for 17 years. It was staffed by 48 doctors and 92 nurses. It had an on-site pharmaceutical manufacturing unit that could produce treatment compounds in any quantity the situation required, which meant that in previous outbreaks, the response time between initial report and treatment delivery had been measured in hours rather than weeks. That station had closed in the first days of the withdrawal. Its staff had gone home, as all human staff had gone home. The nearest remaining council response team was positioned 6 weeks away in the opposite direction. It had 12 staff members and a supply kit designed for emergencies of up to 2,000 patients. The outbreak on Velkara was not 2,000 patients. Ambassador Velkarath sent urgent appeals to the Council's Health and Safety Commission. The Commission responded with documents that were thorough and sympathetic, and explained in considerable detail the current resource limitations in the outer territories. The Commission noted that the situation highlighted a coverage gap that had been identified in previous assessments and was actively under review. A second response followed 10 days later with a more specific assessment and a preliminary resource allocation proposal. The proposal required authorization from 3 separate bodies. Authorizations took time. Meanwhile, on Velkara, the death count grew. The health crisis on Velkara had a particular weight for the Council because Velkarath himself represented that world's parent government. He had been the one to laugh on the day Selene Voss walked out. He had been the one to say that humanity was too small to matter. He had not said either of those things again in some time. He had instead been filing urgent requests with the Council's Health and Safety Commission and reading their detailed, sympathetic responses and watching the death count on his home colony climb each morning when he opened his reports. He was not the only one keeping that kind of count. Across Council space, in dozens of species' home systems and colony worlds and border stations, administrators and citizens alike were beginning to track numbers that they had never needed to track before because they had never before needed to think about where certain services came from. Now they were thinking about it. Now they had reason to. The Torath-Asulan Cold War had lasted 60 years. It had lasted that long because both sides found the status quo economically preferable to escalation. And both sides found it economically preferable largely because of the neutral zone resupply stations operated by human staff in the border systems between their territories. Those stations sold parts, food, fuel, and medical supplies to both fleets at standard rates without political conditions. The human diplomats who ran them had spent decades learning exactly how much each side needed to feel their dignity was respected, and their security was not threatened. And they had been consistently skilled at keeping both feelings maintained. The stations had closed in the first days of the withdrawal. Their staff had gone home. 8 weeks after Selene Voss walked out of the Grand Assembly Hall, a Torathi patrol vessel intercepted a Sulan cargo ship near the border system of Kreth's Pass. There was a dispute about what the cargo manifest should have contained versus what it did contain. The dispute escalated in the way that disputes between heavily armed parties escalate when both sides have been waiting for 60 years for the other side to give them a clear justification. When it was over, there were 2 expanding debris fields and 2 governments with the reason they had been looking for. The Council convened emergency sessions. It passed resolutions urging restraint. It formed a crisis mediation committee. It called on both parties to return to the negotiating table. These things took time, and while they were being done, the war spread to a second system and then a third. The Council's emergency sessions had a new texture. The comfortable certainty that had characterized the chamber before the withdrawal was still present, but it had cracks in it now, visible in the way some delegates sat, in the silences between speeches that lasted a beat longer than they used to, in the questions that were being asked in hallways and side rooms rather than on the floor. The questions were all variants of the same question, which was, how did we not know this would happen? The honest answer was that they had known. They simply had not read the documents that said so. In the archive wing of Nexus Station, in a small room that most delegates had never visited and could not have located without a map, a junior records analyst named Vel was going through documents she had no particular authority to pull, but which were technically accessible under the general research permissions attached to her position. She was young, by Cathari standards not yet 40, with pale gray skin and 2 working arms. She had been assigned to the archive section 8 months ago and had developed, in that time, the archivist's instinct for the distance between what was recorded and what was known. She had begun her research 2 days after the withdrawal, when a colleague had said in passing that the relay tower failures were unfortunate, but essentially unforeseeable. Vel had not been certain that was true. She had gone into the records. She found 17 formal requests, filed by human engineering teams over a period of 9 years, asking the Council to establish a redundancy protocol for relay tower maintenance and to fund training for non-human backup staff who could cover essential systems during any disruption. Each request included technical analysis. Each one specified exactly the risk of service interruption if current staffing arrangements were disturbed. All 17 had been acknowledged. 12 had been sent to review committees. 5 had been marked as resolved, meaning they had been placed in ongoing monitoring programs that tracked the issue without acting on it. She found 23 applications for Council funding to hire and train non-human personnel at the neutral zone resupply stations. The applications cited the specific risk of station closure and border instability if human staffing became unavailable. The applications had been denied consistently over 14 years on budgetary grounds. She found a 34-page proposal, submitted 8 years ago by the Human Medical Liaison Office, for an independent Council-funded medical response network that would not rely on human volunteers. The proposal had been submitted to 5 different commissions. It had been sent back for revision once. After that, it had simply aged in each commission's files without ever reaching a vote. Vel sat in the archive room for a long time after that. The station hummed its regular hum around her. Down the corridor, at intervals, the relay alert beeped from someone's unattended screen, a sound that had been beeping at irregular intervals for nearly 2 weeks without anyone going to silence it or address it. She opened a document and began to write. She was not certain yet what she would do with what she was writing. She was an archivist. Her training was in preservation, not in action. But she had also been trained in the understanding that the purpose of preservation is not the storage of information but its eventual use, and the gap between storage and use was, she was increasingly sure, the exact gap she was sitting in the middle of. She wrote through the night shift. The morning lights came on and she was still writing. The relay alert beeped again, steady and unattended in the corridor outside. It would keep beeping until someone addressed the underlying problem, and addressing the underlying problem, she was learning, was the kind of thing that required more than an alert. It required someone willing to read what the alert was pointing to. Ambassador Shorath of the Delvani Cooperative had spent 30 years as a working diplomat, and had developed, over that time, a particular talent for reading the gap between what a situation appeared to be and what it actually was. Difficult negotiations, close calls, moments when the wrong word in the wrong room would have ended something fragile. He had been through enough of those to trust his instincts when they spoke to him. His instincts had been speaking to him since before his ship crossed the boundary into the sovereign reach. By the time he arrived at Threshold 7, they were speaking quite loudly. The escort had met him at the boundary marker. He had half expected a warship, or at minimum, the kind of display that a small civilization under pressure might use to project strength it was not entirely sure it had. Instead, 3 silver and green vessels from the Human Merchant Authority had appeared alongside his ship, with the ease of ships operating on familiar routes, opened a communication channel before his own crew had finished identifying them, and introduced Lieutenant Dara Osai, who was polite and completely unimpressed by the Council diplomatic markings on Shorath's vessel. The journey to Threshold 7 took 11 hours. Shorath spent most of it at the observation window, and what he saw through it continued to adjust his expectations. He had visited human space once before, years ago, when humanity was still a Council member. He remembered it as energetic but improvised, with the visible signs of a civilization expanding faster than its planning could keep pace with. Patched systems, provisional structures, the particular look of infrastructure being built to solve yesterday's problem rather than tomorrow's. A civilization catching up with itself. That was not what he saw now. The traffic patterns outside his window were organized, moving in defined lanes between stations and relay nodes, whose positioning suggested deliberate planning rather than emergency placement. The stations themselves were newer and larger than what he remembered, built with the design language of permanence. And the relay nodes were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of broken, wrong in the sense of unfamiliar. Different shape, different spacing. Built to a specification he did not recognize from any council standard, which meant they had been built to a specification that was not a council standard, which meant they had been designed and built entirely independently. When he asked Osai about the nodes, the lieutenant said that the Reach used its own relay network, built to its own specifications. He said it worked well. He did not elaborate, and his tone made clear that elaboration was not on offer. Shorath had also noted that the transit corridor his ship passed through was well marked and actively managed. There were clear lane designations. Navigation beacons at regular intervals, recently placed based on their construction type. A traffic management system coordinating movement in and out of the approach zone with the quiet efficiency of infrastructure that had been operating long enough to have worked out its early problems. He asked Os how long the transit management system had been operational. Osai said 18 months. He then said, with the mild directness that Shorath was beginning to identify as a characteristic register, that infrastructure planning in the Reach had begun approximately 8 years ago and accelerated in the 4 years before the withdrawal. Shorath had looked out at the transit lane markers and done the arithmetic quietly. 4 years before the withdrawal, humanity had still been filing formal complaints through council channels. They had been doing both things at the same time, arguing through the correct process with one hand and building the alternative with the other. Not as bad faith, as preparation. They had hoped the arguments would work. They had not assumed they would. Threshold 7 was positioned at the edge of the Reach with the deliberate quality of a formal entrance. Walking through it, Shorath noticed the small things. The corridor proportions were calibrated for several different body types, not just human ones. The lighting in the meeting wing shifted color temperature as he moved between sections in a way that suggested the controls had been adjusted for the species using each area. The food in the waiting area was labeled in multiple languages with complete biological compatibility information. None of this was difficult to arrange if you thought about it carefully before construction began. Most stations did not think about it before construction began. Whoever had built this one had done so. Director General Amara Solis was already in the meeting room. She stood when he entered, shook his hand in the human manner, offered refreshment, and when he declined, sat down and gave him her complete attention without making it feel like scrutiny. She was perhaps 60 years old, with dark hair going silver at the temples, wearing a dark jacket with no rank insignia. She looked like someone who had long since stopped needing to advertise what she was. Shorath delivered the council's prepared statement. He had worked on it carefully and believed it was as good as the available circumstances allowed it to be. It spoke of historical partnership and shared interests and the value of cooperative frameworks. He was aware, as he spoke, that the statement contained an embedded assumption that humanity needed the council enough to find these appeals meaningful. That assumption had been central to the council's entire approach to this crisis. He was becoming less certain it was correct with every hour he spent in the Reach. Solis listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone who is deciding where to begin rather than what to say. "We received your message about the Velkara outbreak," she said. "Yes," Shorath said with care. "The situation is very serious. We were hoping that a temporary assistance arrangement—" "Our biomedical division finished development on an effective treatment compound 6 weeks ago," Solis said. "Clinical trials were completed 3 weeks ago. We have current production capacity sufficient for the full population of Velkara with a standard safety surplus. We are prepared to sell it. Manufacturing rights are included in the package so that the council can establish independent production within 18 months. The pricing terms will be sent over this afternoon." Sell, not share, not donate, not offer as a humanitarian gesture between former partners. Sell with manufacturing rights and a pricing team already prepared. Shorath had handled enough negotiations to recognize when a position had been settled long before the meeting. The relay network, he said. We completed our own relay network 14 months ago, Solis said. Different architecture. It performs better than the council network in most operating conditions, and it is more resilient under electromagnetic interference. We are prepared to discuss joint construction of new nodes in the buffer zones between our territories, or a licensing arrangement for the council to use the new routing protocol on whatever portion of your existing network you reconstruct. Both options remain available. The internal reach network is not available, and that is not a negotiating position. It is a boundary. Shorath looked at her for a moment. In 30 years of diplomacy, he had learned to distinguish between people who said firm things as an opening position and people who said firm things because they were firm. Solis was the second kind. You were ready for this, he said. He had not intended to say it out loud. He said it because it was the most true thing in the room. For the withdrawal, yes, she said. Not always. For many years we believed that better arguments and better evidence would produce better outcomes. We were committed to that belief. We put a great deal of work into it. She looked at him in a straightforward way that contained no drama. At some point, the evidence about the evidence accumulated to a level we could not reasonably ignore. When, Shorath asked, he found that he genuinely wanted to know. Solis considered. When we sat down and mapped every formal request we had ever filed against the current state of the thing we had been requesting help with, she said, and found that every single system now failing in council space had been flagged as a risk in a human complaint at least 5 years before the failure. She paused. We kept the records, every one of them. We thought we might need them eventually. Shorath thought about the 49% relay network, about the Velkara death toll that was still climbing, about the Torath-Asulan war and the 4 systems it had now spread into, about the committees and the commissions and the preliminary reports recommending further assessment. What do you want? He asked. Not the terms. What do you actually want from this meeting? Solis was quiet for a moment that felt genuine, rather than calculated. We wanted to be treated as equal, she said. We wanted the things we built and maintained and protected to be seen as contributions rather than assumed as permanent free services. We wanted when we said something was wrong, someone would check. She looked at him steadily. We do not want those things from the council anymore. We have found them somewhere else. What we want now is a galaxy that works, because a broken galaxy is dangerous for everyone, including us. Shorath wrote his report that evening. He was honest in it, which was harder than it might sound in an official diplomatic report. He included everything he had observed and everything it implied. The last line was short. They were ready. They have been ready for a long time. The message took longer than usual to arrive at Nexus Station. The relay network was running at 49%. The routing took 3 attempts before it found a viable path. That, too, was part of the report. The fleet was assembled quietly over the course of 6 weeks by the 7 species who had decided that the correct answer to a crisis caused by humanity's absence was to end that absence whether humanity agreed or not. Their reasoning was not complicated. The Reach was producing things the Council needed. Negotiations had not moved quickly enough. Therefore, the incentives needed adjusting. 43 warships positioned themselves across the outer transit corridor, connecting the Sovereign Reach to the rest of Council space. Their commanding officers sent a formal notification to the Human Transit Authority, describing the fleet's presence and stating that outgoing traffic was suspended pending resolution of current diplomatic matters. The notification used language that had been reviewed by 3 separate legal departments to avoid triggering the Council's blockade statutes, while doing exactly what a blockade did. Selene Voss was in her office on Threshold Station when the report arrived. She read it through twice. Then she closed the screen and went for a walk. The upper observation deck was quiet at that hour. She walked the outer ring slowly, looking out at the stars, not thinking about anything in particular. After 23 minutes she came back inside, called her aide, and told him to stand down the military readiness reports and get her a recording team instead. "What kind of broadcast?" her aide asked. "Get me 4 hours," she said. "I know what to say." She used 3 hours and 40 minutes of it. She had always worked quickly when she knew precisely what she was doing. The result was 94 minutes long, and it was not a speech. It was something closer to evidence. The broadcast was structured chronologically. It began with humanity's original application for council membership, made 230 years ago, and the 30-year review process that had followed, and the conditions attached to membership upon acceptance that no other species in the same century had been required to accept. It moved forward through time in sequence. The trade route taxation set at 3 times the standard rate in the membership agreement and maintained there despite 17 formal requests for review. The denied applications for colony protection, each one with the vote record attached. The rejected human candidates for council committee positions, with the stated reasons documented. The relay tower maintenance requests, filed 17 times over 9 years. The neutral zone resupply station funding applications, the medical network proposal and the 5 commissions it had been sent to, and the 0 votes that had ever been taken on it. Every document was genuine. Every date was accurate. Every case number matched a record in the council's own archive, because Vell had spent 4 months pulling those records and organizing them before making contact with Cellini's office, through a channel that several people on both sides had quietly agreed not to document. The final section of the broadcast moved from the historical record to the present. The relay network running at 49% and still falling, tracked against the maintenance requests that had predicted exactly this outcome. The Velkara death toll, tracked against the medical network proposal that had predicted exactly this need. The Torathasulan War, spreading now into its 5th system, tracked against the resupply station funding applications that had predicted exactly this risk. Each failure against the specific, dated, case-numbered warning that had preceded it. The last image was the empty human seat in the Grand Assembly Hall. The last line, spoken over it in Cellini's calm voice, was, "We told you. We told you many times in the correct format, through the correct channels, with evidence. The records are available for verification." The broadcast went out on every open frequency simultaneously across council space, the sovereign reach, and 17 neutral systems. The translation package covered all 412 council languages and had taken 30 human translators 19 days to prepare. They had been working on it for 2 months. Everyone had been ready. The hardline bloc realized what was happening about 40 minutes into the transmission, when they began receiving word that citizens were gathering in public spaces across their home worlds to watch it on shared screens. By that point, the signal had already propagated through enough of the relay network, using the surviving 49% to maximum effect, to reach every inhabited world in council space. The broadcast could not be stopped once it had started. It had been distributed through too many nodes simultaneously. People watched it. They watched the documents appear on screen one after another, each one dated and sourced. They watched the vote records that had defeated protection applications for worlds that were now unprotected. They watched the relay maintenance requests filed year after year in the same careful format, each one matched to a tower that was now dark or degraded. The reaction across species was not uniform. Some were angry, some were ashamed, some were defensive. What was common across most of them was something quieter and harder to dismiss: recognition. The feeling of seeing something that you had not known existed and realizing immediately that it explained things you had not been able to explain before. The broadcast had a particular effect on the species closest to the hardline faction's position. For them, the experience of watching it was not primarily emotional. It was mathematical. They had built their policy positions on a set of assumptions about the balance of dependence between humanity and the Council. The broadcast did not attack those assumptions. It simply replaced them with data. The data showed a balance of dependence that ran in the opposite direction from what had been assumed, documented over 2 centuries, filed correctly, and ignored. Several delegations requested access to the full archive files to verify what they had seen. The files were provided immediately. They were genuine and had always been available. An archivist had simply organized them into a form readable by people who were not archivists. The Delvani Cooperative withdrew from the hardline block first, 18 hours after the broadcast ended. Shoreth had filed his own report, and the Cooperative's council had read both and made a decision. Then the Marathi Assembly withdrew. Then the Fel Collective and the Setharan guilds announced their withdrawal in the same afternoon, their communications crossing each other in the relay network. The fleet at the transit corridor sat in place for 4 more days while its commanding officers sent increasingly urgent requests for updated orders to capitals that were no longer in a position to give them. On the 4th day, the fleet went home. It went quietly. Nothing had been fired. Nothing had been damaged. There was nothing to show for the 6 weeks of assembly and positioning except a line in the official record, and the knowledge that 43 warships had been moved to a corridor, and then moved back. Vel watched the assembly vote from the visitors' gallery. She was not a delegate. She had been given a visitor's pass through the Marathi Assembly contact, who had been reading her work for 3 months, and believed it was important enough to act on. She sat in the gallery and watched the floor with the focused attention she had been trained to give to records. Only the records here were being made in real time. She had put a motion before the council through the Marathi delegate. It had 2 parts. The first was a formal apology to humanity. The second was a proposed new treaty framework, not membership, which the Reach had clearly moved past wanting, but a formal partnership, equal standing, binding commitments with actual enforcement mechanisms, a review structure with real teeth. A document built to hold, not to be filed and forgotten. The debate ran for 9 hours and 20 minutes. Vel sat through all of it. She ate her packed meal in her seat and listened to speeches that ranged from genuinely remorseful to strategically self-interested, with every point on the spectrum in between. She had stopped being surprised that remorse and self-interest frequently arrived at the same conclusion, though she had not stopped thinking it was worth noting. During the afternoon recess, a senior council official came and sat in the row near her. He was one of the older members, one of the few remaining who had been in the hall on the day Selene Voss walked out. He had the look of someone who had recently understood something that had been sitting directly in front of him for a long time. "What do you think they'll say?" he asked. "When we send the motion to the Reach." Vel considered the question carefully. She had spent months inside humanity's records. She had read enough of what they wrote to have a sense of how they thought. "They'll read it word by word," she said, "all of it, and then they'll want to know what we are actually going to change." The motion passed, 261 votes to 148. The result was transmitted to Threshold Station through a human-built relay node on a human-designed network, using a routing protocol the Council had learned about 3 months ago when the alternative became necessary. Solis's response arrived in under an hour. 4 words: "What are you changing?" The first thing every Council delegate noticed when they arrived at Threshold Station for the summit was that everything worked. This should not have been remarkable. In a large and ancient interstellar civilization, functional systems were supposed to be the baseline, not the exception. But 9 months of cascading failures had recalibrated everyone's expectations. The delegates were accustomed now to translation systems that stuttered, to temperature controls optimized for one species at the expense of others sharing the room, to food service that required careful navigation of unlabeled ingredients, to communication equipment that dropped signals at unpredictable intervals, because the relay network was still running at well below full capacity. Threshold Station had none of those problems. The translation systems were fast and accurate. The climate in each section adjusted well for the species using it. The food was clearly labeled in each species' own language with complete biological compatibility information. The communication systems ran on the Reach's network, which ran perfectly. Someone had built this place to work, and it did. And the contrast with the past 9 months sat quietly in the back of every delegate's mind throughout the 9 days of the summit in a way that nobody officially acknowledged and everyone felt. Director General Solis opened the first session without ceremony. She said she did not believe in long opening remarks at working meetings. She said both sides understood the history and that she did not intend to summarize it. She said she assumed everyone had read the treaty framework documents that had been circulated, because the Reach's team had spent 3 months writing them and she considered that worth reading. Then she sat down and opened to Section 1, Paragraph 1, and asked if there were any questions. There were many questions. The summit lasted 9 days. The medical technology negotiation was the hardest. 4 of those 9 days were spent on it. Several council delegates argued with genuine feeling that the plague treatment should be provided without cost on humanitarian grounds, because people were still dying on Velkara and 12 other worlds where the outbreak had spread, and it was wrong to attach commercial terms to medicine that could save lives. Solis's lead negotiator, a quiet and methodical man named Dr. Fenwick, listened to each speech and then said, with the same measured patience each time, that the humanitarian argument would carry considerably more weight if the Council had approved the funding proposal for an independent medical network 8 years ago, and that the current situation was not a natural disaster, but the foreseeable result of a foreseeable policy choice, and that charging for the solution was not inhumanity, but the normal terms under which work is recognized and sustained. After 4 days, an agreement was reached. The treatment was sold at a price that included a scaled discount for active outbreak emergencies and a payment structure accessible to smaller council members. Manufacturing rights were included. The Reach's biomedical team would send technical advisors to assist with production setup at council facilities. The relay network discussion was cleaner, largely because humanity's position had been stated clearly from the beginning and did not shift. The internal reach network was not on the table. The Council could license access to the new routing protocol, which would substantially improve efficiency on whatever portion of their existing infrastructure they rebuilt, or they could negotiate joint construction of new nodes in the buffer zones. Both options remained available throughout. The internal network did not. The Council accepted this on the 3rd day, without the extended argument that had accompanied everything else, which Shoreth privately noted as a sign that genuine understanding was sometimes possible. The Torath-Asulan ceasefire framework required 3 full days and involved parties who were not in the room. Both the Torathi and the Sulan had sent formal protests that decisions affecting their conflict were being made without their participation. Solis's team acknowledged the protests politely and continued working. The framework they produced did not end the war. It established the conditions under which it could be ended, a legal structure for independent mediation, a defined budget, rules of engagement for the mediators, and an acceptance requirement from both warring parties before any mediation could begin. It was the most that outside parties could build. Everyone at the table understood it was not enough and signed it, because enough was not available and something was better than nothing, and the alternative to building an imperfect structure was to build nothing at all. Selene Voss worked in a side room off the main corridor for all 9 days. She was not at the primary negotiating table. She had a team of 12 with her, and they went through every section of every draft agreement line by line, paying attention to the people who would actually live under whatever was agreed. The engineers going back to the relay towers, the medics setting up the new response network, the station workers whose terms of employment needed to be clearly defined and fairly structured, and not subject to the informal arrangements that had made the previous 2 centuries as exploitable as they had been. She sent marks back to the main table when she found things that needed changing. Most came back corrected. Some came back unchanged because the main table had made a different call. She noted both and kept working. On the evening of the 8th day, she went out to the small observation deck on the station's outer ring. She was tired in the particular way that comes from sustained attention to things that matter. The stars outside were clear. She stood and looked at them and did not think about very much. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Vel, the Cathari archivist, stood at the entrance to the deck with the expression of someone uncertain whether they were intruding. "Come in," Selene said. Vel came and stood at a respectful distance. They were both quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I read the full published version of your research," Selene said, "not just the summary." "I hope it was useful," Vel said. "You matched every complaint we ever filed to the system it eventually predicted would fail," Selene said. "Every single one. That must have taken a long time." "About 4 months," Vel said. "But you had done the harder work. You had written the complaints very clearly. You always wrote very clearly." Selene was quiet for a moment. "Some of my colleagues used to say that all the filing was pointless," she said, "that no one was reading it. I always said the record was real whether or not anyone read it." She looked at the stars. "I did not know I was right in quite the way I turned out to be right." "In Cathari archival practice, we say that a record is a form of patience," Vel said carefully. "You write the truth down and you wait for the moment when the truth is needed. Sometimes that moment comes soon. Sometimes it comes very late. But you write it anyway because the truth does not become less true because no one has read it yet." Selene looked at her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted in the way that long-held things shift when they are finally set down. "Thank you," she said, "for reading it, for counting all of it." They went inside together. The final session was on the morning of the 9th day. The new compact was signed at the long table in the main conference room, with Director General Solis and the Council Chair signing first and 37 additional member species following after them. 11 species declined to sign. That was noted in the record without comment. The framework was designed to allow new signatories over time. Everything in the document was designed to work over time, because that was the only honest way to design anything meant to last. Selene stood at the front of the room to give the closing address. She had not written a long speech. She looked at the room for a moment, taking in all the different faces and forms gathered in it, and then she said what she had come to say. "We did not leave because we hated you. We left because we had to learn what we were worth. Not what anyone told us we were worth, but what we actually were. We hope you have had the chance to learn it too." She paused. "What we are building here is not a return to what existed before. It is something new. It does not have history behind it yet. It has 9 days of difficult conversations and a set of written commitments that we will all, I hope, actually honor." She looked around the room one final time. "Let us make it work." 3 days later, the first group of human engineers returned to Relay Tower 9. Their contracts had been negotiated at the summit. Clear terms, fair compensation, council-funded redundancy teams to be established within 2 years. The tower was the one whose maintenance alert had been the first signal, months ago, of what was coming. The team lead was an engineer named Priya Chen. She had worked on Tower 9 for 6 years before the withdrawal, and knew it the way you know a place you have spent long hours inside learning its particular habits and requirements. She walked the access corridor with her diagnostic tablet, noting everything that had drifted, everything dark, everything that needed calibration. The list was long. The work would take most of the day. She and her team worked for 14 hours. They followed their own protocols, the ones they had written themselves through years of doing this work and understanding what it needed. No one was monitoring them. No one was timing them. They did the work because the work needed doing, and they were the people who understood how. When the last calibration was complete and the final dark secondary node came back online, Priya stood at the central console and watched the status board. One by one, the lights changed. Routes that had been dark for months opened. Signal strength climbed back toward the numbers she recognized from years of ordinary operation. The restored signal reached the next tower, and from there the next, the recovery spreading outward through the network as each restored link enabled the ones beyond it. She sent the clearance report to the authorities' network office and then sat down on the floor of the maintenance bay with her back against the wall. She closed her eyes. The tower hummed steadily around her, doing exactly what it had always been designed to do. Out in the dark between the stars, the network lights came on,